Nice to meet you all. My name's Victor Bolshov, and I'm a web developer, as you probably guessed. I've been developing web projects for like 17 years already. All kinds of them, working for larger and smaller companies. The last thing about me is that weird crocodile that you see below my name is my Twitter handle. Don't ask. It's been there for ages. So, and I'm gonna talk about APIs today. Basically, my talk will cover some aspects of how you approach to developing your APIs, how you approach to standards in your APIs, and documentation, and some aspects of automation. And I'm also excited to tell you about one small piece of software that I basically developed myself. First, it was for the company that I work for now. Then I was actually allowed to open source it, so it's now on GitHub, and you will see the URLs. As talking about that piece of software, I strongly encourage you to think of it, and when I will be presenting it to you, just think of it as of an approach more than of an actual software that you are about to use. It's really in beta stage, and I will show examples of code, but please treat it as an approach. So let's actually start, right? So who's been into API lately? So doing some development of API or consuming some APIs. Well, I see pretty much everybody is in this business, right? It's true, we are now moving rapidly towards more and more APIs. More and more teams are embracing the new patterns like microservices, and then everything becomes an API, right? Basically, even if just developing a simple website which just has some JSON calls in it, then this website becomes an API for itself, right? And the more and more APIs you develop, the more you think about how you standardize your approach towards developing an API. And then there you go, NFS, the need for standard. We've come a long way from things like Corba, which is really something from outer space for me, personally. It's like, what is something about objects. I really don't remember what it stands for. Then we got SOAP, we got REST, and these days we also got GraphQL. You see that REST is actually in bold, and that's because I'm going to talk more about REST APIs, which is probably the most widespread, especially maybe among PHP developers. Who is using REST? Okay, yeah, that's it. Talking about REST, when you choose this approach, you actually choose only the highest level of standard. So the REST doesn't actually give you really much in terms of standardization, right? You still have to develop your own protocol, or use some protocol that is developed for you, right? So we have a situation of a number of competing standards here, and thus it's always tempting to develop your own. Sometimes it originates from just simple thing like my API is going to be just 2 or 3 JSON calls, and I'm not gonna use some weird multi-line configuration for that. I'm just gonna deliver some JSON in response, and that's it. Then your APIs tend to grow, and then you tend to think that, okay, I'll have to specify some error messages, I have to specify various response codes, and then there you go. You basically implement the same thing that people have already thought about before you, but you implement it differently, and that's not documented and stuff. So better not. better just remember that famous XKCD comic and don't develop it yourself unless you really know what you're doing and you really need it. So what's there to choose from actually? The most widely used REST API standards that I personally have come across are OpenAPI and JSON API. There's also GraphQL, which is definitely not REST at all. I just listed it here because it's maybe it's some perspective for the future of APIs, and maybe this approach or some similar approach will be widely used in the future. I don't see it really widely implemented right now. And well, our team has chosen OpenAPI in favor of its probably the most successful competitor, JSON API, just because OpenAPI, in our opinion, offers some more simple, understandable approach to APIs than the other one. Okay, so I'm gonna actually focus on the OpenAPI standard. And yeah, what exactly is OpenAPI? Who has ever used OpenAPI? Okay, so probably maybe a half of all those who said that they use API. OpenAPI, and it was formerly called Swagger specification, is specification for a format for your REST APIs. Basically, it allows you to describe everything you can think of related to your API, starting from things like meta information, the description, and licensing information, and ending up with actual endpoints description, and your requests and response inputs and outputs. How does it look like? Well, this is the JSON example. I wonder if you can read it. It's actually not there to be really read, just for reference. So you can see that it's kind of a lot of entries in a JSON file here. It comes also in the form of YAML. So basically, the most interesting part starts with the paths entry that you see in the lower part of the screen. So there you go. You describe every endpoint and what it can, what requests can it receive, and what responses can it produce. And then how does it relate to Swagger? Because I will be using this term over and over in this talk. And I think who is familiar with Swagger? But those who are familiar with OpenAPI are also familiar with Swagger, right? So Swagger is a set of tools which are essentially open source, and they are built around the OpenAPI specification. And yeah, the major tools include Swagger Editor, which is a nice editor for this weird JSON stuff. And basically, you edit the YAML file there. It also can validate your the result of your work. And also Swagger includes documentation generator and also important code generator. So based on your Swagger file, you can generate a fully featured client SDK in a variety of languages, starting from things like Ada and ending up with JavaScript, or basically they offer like several tens of languages, obviously including PHP as well. And yeah, if you're interested in reading more about Swagger, then visit swagger.io website. This specification is obviously not perfect. Well, what is perfect? To my mind, the worst flaw of this specification is the lack of hypermedia support, which essentially makes it not REST at all, right? if you are that stuck to hypermedia, and if you want hypermedia support, then probably OpenAPI and Swagger is just not something for you, I must say. Because they have an approach towards this problem, but it's really their own approach. It doesn't actually implement hypermedia. It's really a different thing. It's called links, and I'm not gonna touch it in depth. So if you are choosing Swagger for its simplicity, relative simplicity, well, and for the tooling that it has around it, then you just have to admit that, like, okay, we have no hypermedia support in our REST API. Then some people actually complain about the build size that is increased due to Swagger. Well, we are using PHP, and we only include Swagger things in our development and build stages of pipeline. So we don't actually pollute our production environment with that. So it's not that a bad thing. Then, well, when you use some sort of thing like a new specification, you obviously need to educate your development team to use it correctly. As when people start with it, they sometimes do certain things that are actually not meant to be done with this tool. Well, I think the only way to deal with this is basically to educate. Also, a lot of people actually say that writing and working with Swagger file, an OpenAPI specification file, is sometimes harder and more time-consuming than the actual implementation of the API. You have seen that with Jsend, right? So imagine if you have like 50 endpoints, then it ends up with like a bloated and huge Jsend file or YAML file or whatever. And yeah, it can be a bit frustrating. And this is exactly what I basically thought about. And we were talking about this thing with one of my friends, like some year ago, maybe a bit less. And he said that, well, I would like to have my endpoint specifications to be written just right next to code, right on the server side. And I was like, wow. Probably that was how it looked at that time. And then I just began thinking of it more and more, and then realized that there's actually nothing wrong with this idea. And basically, in like a month or so, I implemented the first version of, we talked it over with our team, and then I implemented the first version of what we called Swagger Generator. Like I said, it's in beta stage. It doesn't implement Swagger and OpenAPI specification fully, and right now I'll be talking about this piece of software, and I'll be showing some code examples. But think of it as an approach, so that how can you move your specification closer to the code? Basically, what the approach is, it is that you no longer have this the Swagger file as actually part of what you're working on. Instead, you're generating it. And then the most valuable part of the specification is the description of the endpoints, right? And then you probably have your endpoints implemented in some sort of controller, right? Be it like multi-action controller, or be it just single action controller. It's anyway a class. And then what I did was I just made a simple interface, and then you may implement that interface in your controller. And in this way, you show to the Swagger generator, like compiler, you may call it, to the Swagger generator, that this particular class is actually a Swagger endpoint controller, and that the generator can grab the specification from it. The interface has just one class, and just one method that you have to implement, and I'll show it to you a bit later. So this way, what do we actually achieve? Instead of having a huge Swagger file with all our endpoints that lies somewhere in your code base and doesn't have a direct relation to your controllers, instead of that, you have parts of this Swagger file scattered around your code base, and they actually lie close to the implementation of your endpoint server, so that it's really easier to watch what's happening and to relevantly change your specification once you have changed your implementation. Then, in order to actually use the library, you'll have to install two composer libraries. One is Swagger Generator Integration, and the other is Swagger Generator. And only the first one is needed during runtime, so only the first one is needed on your in your production code, because you still need the interfaces, right? So integration is basically just a set of interfaces for the generator, and that's it. And then the generator itself is only needed in dev times, on build time, this kind of thing. And I think that it can be applied virtually to any PHP project, at least any PHP project that uses classes as controllers. Well, I think it's by far the most, right? And then I also have written a tool for automatic discovery of Swagger Generator compatible endpoints. So it basically scans a whole directory tree and finds classes, extracts those of them that implement the Swagger server interface, and then calls that classes method to generate Swagger specification. Is it open source? Yes. So here's the links. Here is how you install it via Composer. And let's see in more detail how do you actually implement this. So first install the library, then imagine you have some controller, and then you just add the implements keyword to the class, and then say that implements the Swagger server interface, and then you have to implement the static method get Swagger paths. Why static? Because we don't want to instantiate your controllers. We just want to get the information about endpoints. So it would be weird if we instantiated all the controllers and did all the job that may be done in the constructors of controllers during generation of the endpoint specification. And then, in order to have this automated, you obviously will need some sort of command line script that actually uses some functionality provided by Swagger Generator. So you instantiate, for instance, a directory scanner, which scans, like I said, everything under that directory and finds all the compatible controllers and generates specification for you. Yeah. What next would you actually want from that kind of thing? Well, you already have your project, right? Then you probably decide to integrate Swagger, and then in your pipeline you could basically, upon an event like push, upon push, you would generate your Swagger file using Swagger Generator. Then you will also generate documentation for your API, and then you will generate SDK and optionally update your dependent projects, because if you have an API project and then a set of clients that consume that API, you might want those client projects also updated in turn, right? How do I describe the endpoints for Swagger Generator? There are two basic ways. So one way is just to use a PHP array, and it will just mimic the whole Swagger specification structure. So you can just basically take a part of your existing Swagger file, convert it to a PHP array, and then use that without basically any change. This might save you a lot of work, but then it's less readable. Then you'd get no autocompletion, and it's kind of error prone because it's arrays. Who likes arrays? I don't. And then there's another way. You basically use the objects provided by the library. So it's more readable, you get autocompletion and less space for errors. And well, the disadvantage is that obviously some work is required if you have already a Swagger file, and you will actually have to convert it to object calls. And this is how it looks actually in the code. So on the left side, you can see that this is on a specification array style, and it basically is what a Swagger specification would look like. And on the right side is an object-oriented one, well, you can choose. So returning back to what I already said way longer, I would like you to think of this as an approach. So you don't necessarily not necessarily like to use this particular piece of software, and it's I would be very glad if you be a contributor or something, and if you download and use it. But I think of it in first place as an approach, so that we split the big file and we put the specification closer to code, and then we basically make our lives easier. That's what this is all about, basically. Then one cool feature of OpenAPI is that you actually can define your own types. It's specifically useful when you have some complex types, like I don't know, user or a category or product. Then whatever API endpoint that is using those types, you don't actually have to repeat yourself in your specification. You may just have your data schema in your Swagger specification file, and then whenever you want your API endpoint uses that type, say be it user or again product, then you just say this type is a reference to this type mentioned in schema. Does Swagger generator support that? Yes, it does. And this corresponding class is called ref, and because a reference to type will need to be resolved into actual type, then I also came up with a concept of reference resolver. So whenever you generate a ready-made specification, you will have to specify resolvers for your types that you actually reference. Using a complex type also is available in two ways. First is just array style, then you specify that it references a type name, and this is literally the Swagger syntax. And also the object-oriented style is available, and then you basically have to register a resolver for this type. In this case, the type is called weirdly type name. I should have come up with something better. Yeah, and you can see a sample type resolver which I just used for our test suite. So basically, whenever it encounters a type named type name, it returns a Swagger object and adds one with just one single integer property. And you can have as many resolvers as you like. So I prefer for our project to have one resolver per package. You can have one resolver per type, for instance. Then also there's a nice thing as some request and response format that you use for your APIs. For instance, one of them is Jsend. Have you ever used Jsend? It's a tiny specification for request and response. Well, okay, I have used it, so I came up with a ready-made solution for that one as well. It's basically about just having your response structured in a way that you see below. So basically all your responses include status and then like data, which can be arbitrary data, and then message and which is an error message essentially, and the error code. Well, the two latter obviously are only for error responses. So with Swagger generator, you can also specify just the type that your API endpoint returns as JSON response, and you specify the type of data. So basically, you see here that we return an array of integers, which corresponds to the data that has to be returned. And this is basically the example of a response that is returned from that endpoint. And I don't give you the example of the Swagger specification for it because it would be kind of wordy. Yeah, it is wordy. It's also a minus of OpenAPI, but I think it's the same with practically any other standard. You can also set some meta information for your API. I won't actually spend too much time here. So licenses and all kinds of other different things. Then this is basically injected in your resulting Swagger specification. And you will also like to make some more automation, right? Once you have your Swagger file auto-generated, and basically you might not even use this auto-generation stuff, but obviously you would benefit, if you don't yet, from some automation tools that exist if you use Swagger. So basically, if you use this Docker image, Swagger CodeGen CLI, you will get with this simple set of commands a ready-made API documentation based on your Swagger specification, plus, in this case, PHP client code. It's kind of nice to have, right? And then you may set up your various kinds of options for the generated client. In case of PHP, you may set options for like the composer package that is generated and stuff like that. Also, if you use microservices approach, you would also benefit from some automation, so that, like I said already, you can just automatically update from your pipeline the clients that depend on your API. So whenever you push to your API server project, the pipeline generates Swagger file, then generates documentation and client SDK. Then it pushes to the SDK repository, and then the SDK pipeline in turn updates all kinds of dependent projects. And yeah, here we go. If any questions, I would welcome it. So the question is which version of OpenAPI did I use? Yes, I used the latest version. Yeah.
So that Jsend, it looked like it had a status in it. Is that not different to the status code of HTTP response? Like if it's success, why are we just not using 200?
Okay, the question was about Jsend request response format, and it's basically a very basic response format, and it's kind of different from HTTP status So you basically have just success and error. It's a very basic thing. So if you're developing a serious the REST API, you probably would not like to use it, but for simple things like communicating of I don't know, website view in JavaScript with like backend, it kind of works. So it's different. It's not an HTTP status. Yeah.
What is the difference with the existing library, for example, from Shirkoti, where you can generate the Swagger files through annotations, where you also document your APIs on the spot, above your functions or in the models?
Well, the difference is that this one doesn't use annotations. Obviously, that's also something to take a look at, right? I personally think that doing this stuff in annotations is kind of a bit also complex, and it's not real code. You don't get that support from IDE, so it's way different. But it's an option. Like I said, it's actually the same approach, right? So yeah, if you like that one, go for it.
If you use an IDE as a piece of storm, you will get as well the same auto-completion on the text.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, that works also. Right. So it's example of basically it's the example of the same approach, just it's not in the code, it's in annotation, so it's in comments. Fine. Maybe I will take a closer look at it once again.
OpenAPI describing your API endpoint?
Yeah, they are really different, and then you basically anyway you have to implement something on top of JSON API, right? And this is actually something that had distracted our team from that one. Like it's not that standardized then, in our opinion. So like. Oh, sorry, I forgot to repeat the question. So question was about JSON API and difference between JSON API and OpenAPI. And now the second question was about can we actually use JSON API and describe it with OpenAPI? Yes, you can. Short answer is yes, you can. The long answer is it's painful. Like JSON API is really wordy, and you have to be really careful about how you describe it with OpenAPI then. It's possible though. I've tried that, been there. Well then. And thank you all for coming.